Hello and welcome to Eastern Horizon. This is Malik Ayub Sumbul, and we are live on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So today I have joined by Dr. Glenn Dyson. He is a professor of the political science with a research focus on the geoeconomics, Russian foreign policy, and Eurasian integration from Oslo, Norway. Thank you very much, Dr. Glenn, for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
My pleasure. So I didn't have a long intro of our today's discussion, but let me directly go to the Venezuela situation because that is quite big international headline right now. Donald Trump was previously mean that the charges that they frame against Venezuela and the Nicolas Maduro, it was about the narco-terrorism charges. And then we saw that the president of the Venezuela was kidnapped and abducted and taken away from his country. And now we saw that recently the Donald Trump has stated that the 30 million to 50 million barrel of the oil that will come to the US. So how you see this, that those people who are saying that it is not something for grabbing the oil resources, then what else we can narrate from this statement?
Well, I think there are many objectives. I think the overarching objective for the United States is that it recognizes that the world has become multipolar, many centers of power, China being the most important competitor, and they see that all of America's and now has China as its main trade partner. And so for the United States, when the world is multipolar, have to make priorities. So it's essentially saying it has to focus primarily on the Western Hemisphere and Asia. So this is why they revive, well, they call it the Monroe Doctrine. It's more accurately to call it the Dunroe Doctrine because what they demand now seems to be exclusive influence across Latin America, which is why they made it clear it's not just that they want access to Venezuela's energy resources, they also want to exclude China, Russia, and others from accessing it as well. So there's been many reasonings given here. One, of course, is this hemisphere is ours, as Trump said. The other one would be he claimed this is our oil, we want it back. So it's something he's repeated many times. Obviously, it's about oil, but then he also needs some legitimacy beyond it. So there's a lot of talk about narco-terrorism and this kind of things, which is a very thin, weak argument, to be honest. But what I found interesting is that he hadn't jumped on the very liberal democratic excuse for using military force. As you know, the Western countries over the past 30 years always refer to liberal democracy when they want to push international law aside. So want to protect human rights, promote democracy. This is what you do when you bomb other countries. And indeed, the Europeans even gave the Nobel Peace Prize to Machado on this premise that, she's calling for the attack on her own country. We say, oh, that's because she likes democracy. So we kind of had this excuse that Trump could use, and he didn't really go for it to such an extent. And he even was quite dismissive of Machado as well. So it is something different, we say. I mean, U.S. imperialism is not new, but this is definitely a different wrapping to it.
No, but which kind of the precedent that the U.S. is going to set, especially when they are going and taking a president of the Venezuela back to the United States? So this is a kidnapping, and which kind of the precedent they set, and when they set this precedent, what they expect, because the White House a spokesperson was saying, I listened him, that he is saying that ultimately that is the power that control. So it's mean that if there is more power than the United States in the world, then the things will be done with the power. So US is actually bulldozing the international order and the United Nations. So how you see this trend?
Well, I think it can spread in the United States, but also beyond, abroad. And within the United States, obviously, this sets a very bad precedent. The idea that you can just fly in, kill a lot of people, kidnap the president, beat up his wife, and then present them the next day in a court in New York and try to make it sound legitimate and legal. It is quite problematic, especially when the United States have already said that, well, next might be Colombia, it might be Cuba, it might be Mexico, maybe Panama, Nicaragua, and that's just in Latin America. So it's very problematic. But as you suggested, what if other countries start to do the same as well? This kind of brazenness, it should come as a surprise in a unipolar order, because in a hegemonic order where there's only the United States, the US can say it's one set of rules for me and a different set of rules for everyone else. It can say this because it has the power to back it up. Again, this is what we've seen over the past 30 years. The US can interfere in domestic affairs, it can invade, it can cut off territories from other countries, it can do what it wants, and it can make up its own excuses because there's so much power was concentrated in the US. But now that power disperses and you have a multipolar system, why shouldn't, for example, the Chinese, the Russians do exactly the same? I'm not saying they would. I think they're a bit too cautious about throwing away international law in this way, as opposed to Trump. But this denigrates all of international law. And indeed, if other countries continue to follow international law while the US violates it, what's the incentive for the US to follow international law? So there has to be some reciprocity in place in order for it to be sustained.
So, as you said, that the world is transforming into a multipolar world. So, as we can expect from this multipolar order towards United States, if these actions will grow, and how easy for United States to extract this in American countries. Even he threatened to the Colombia, and even there was a response from the Colombian president. So where you think that the situation will head, and which kind of the resistance the US can face in coming days and months?
Well, I think that what the US does now is foolish because it can have some short-term benefits. I mean, when Trump first came in his second term, he did the same to Panama. He said, I'm going to take the Panama Canal, and then it belongs to us. And then, of course, Panama, they made some concessions. They were pulled back from the Belt and Road Initiative of China. They gave special privileges to the US. And then, of course, Trump can go home to his base back home and say, well, look what I got. Our former leaders, we were in decline because our former leaders were weak. Now now we're strong because of me. Now we get all of these good deals out of nothing. And so the US will have a more beneficial position in the international system, and he will look like a hero back home. The problem is that this is a very short-term strategy, because over time, the rest of the international system knows that the United States is a bully. It's someone you can't trust. That is, if you can't defend yourself, the Americans will run over you. So what you're going to see then is both economic and military partnerships being established in opposition to the United States. And if you live in the Americas now, you don't want to be too dependent on the United States for trade. You don't want to depend on their banks, on their currency, anything they can use economic coercion. And when the US sets in its military, you want to make sure that you have ample of drones and missiles from other countries, which can be used to deter the United States. So if you behave like this, naturally, there will be a buildup, a balancing of the United States. You can't just run around the world bullying everyone, assume that they will give in short term, but in the long term, they will begin to develop resistance to you, like a virus. And I think this is what you're going to see. So I think the United States is wasting a lot of its goodwill and reputation across the world.
So let me come to your neighbor. That after this Venezuela situation, the US, the Donald Trump mentioned about the Greenland, and that is also coming into the headlines. So next week, I think that Rubio is going to meet with some Danish leaders. So how you think that the United States rhetoric, this is a rhetoric, or it is something like this, that the United States really want to get this Greenland, and what could be the reaction from the US alliance, especially the NATO and the European Union? So where you see European Union in this chapter?
Well, again, I think that Donald Trump is the president of low-hanging fruit. He would like to make some threats, show some power and strength, and then he would like others to bow and give him something. So he might not actually use military force. He won't rule out the use of military force, but this could be simply a negotiation tactic. That is, if he threatens Denmark with the use of military force to get Greenland, then at the same time, he will later on meet with them, as he does now, and he will offer to buy it off them instead. and they maybe even give them some privileges in Greenland, at least temporary, then Greenland would the Danes would achieve two things. One, they would get paid, and second, they would preserve NATO. You don't want to end up in a shooting war with the United States. So I think that this is the approach they're taking. I think the Europeans can see what it's doing, which is why they are arguing that they will fight against the US. That's not going to happen. I think that's just empty rhetoric. I could be wrong, but I think so far this is the American tactic. One, they can just use military force to invade, but this is problematic because then it will be seen as illegal. And given that the US is so polarized itself, the next administration, if it's a Democrat administration, they might want to patch things up with the Europeans by giving them back what Trump stole from them. So I think if you can get a signature and a sale, and here's the money, then it would, and with the consent, then it would be more permanent in nature as well. And he wouldn't throw away the partnership. So I think that's what he's going to do. He's going to threaten military force, then offer money to buy it. If that doesn't work, he might stage a democratic revolution, similar to what they did in Ukraine when they toppled the government in 2014. Because if they can get Greenland to secede from Denmark, then Greenland will be all of its own with its 50,000 something citizens, and it will be much more exposed to being absorbed into the United States. So it might be done in different steps. If everything else fails, I don't rule out that he would use military force.
How much margin and how much European leaders could go in the resistance against this move, if there is any kind of the possibility, or if there is anything that the US trying to impose something? So do you think that the European leaders have a margin of some resistance?
No, the Europeans can't do anything, and this is why the Americans sees an opportunity. They wouldn't do this to a country like Russia, China, India, which would be able to resist. The problem for Europe is that they, over the years, made themselves excessively dependent on the United States, both militarily and economic. Now, in the military sphere, they're even more exposed now because the Europeans were so desperate to keep America in Europe as a pacifier that from the early 1990s, they agreed to beginning this role of a NATO expansion, even trying to expand to Ukraine, all the things they knew would make an enemy out of Russia. They did it nonetheless, because this was the price they had to pay to have America on the continent. The problem now for the Europeans is that by making an enemy out of Russia, they have become so dependent on the US for security because, well, we see this now. The US is NATO, essentially. So for this reason, the Americans can do anything they want, which is why after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States could blow up our energy infrastructure with the attack on Nord Stream, and the Europeans had to nod along and pretend as if it was the Russians. This is how obedient and sad the continent has become. But that's the security aspect. You also have the economic. Keep in mind that 20 years ago, the economy of EU and US was very similar. This is all gone now. And furthermore, the Americans keep putting demands on the Europeans that, you have to build up the unipolar order. So don't trade with the enemy, essentially. So you have to cut all your trade ties with Russia. Now they have to begin to cut their trade with China. That is, don't buy any Chinese tech. And, while you're at it, put some sanctions on the Indians or tariffs, punish them because they're not doing well. So the Europeans are being cut off from all other centers of power in a multipolar system. Now, this is a disaster because in a multipolar system, the US has less interest in Europe, and the Europeans put all their eggs in the American basket and becoming less relevant and more politically dependent. So with this excessive dependence on the United States, both economic, militarily, and political, you can say, the US can do whatever it wants, and that's exactly what it's doing. We already seen this before. The Europeans always try to appease Trump, hoping that their obedience will be rewarded, but all they will get is contempt. Look what he did with the EU with the trade deal. He makes the EU show up at his golf course in Scotland, and he puts a horrible deal in front of them. The EU says this is a horrible deal, but they will sign it nonetheless. That's the price we have to pay now as the vassals of the United States. So, no, this is what happens when you become too dependent on any country. This is why, for example, India developed a nuclear weapon so it wouldn't become Japan, completely subordinated to the United States in terms of its foreign policy. So I think this is the lesson, and this is why the Americans will do what they want. and the Europeans will just have to accept.
Mhm. So, where you see the Ukraine peace deal in the aftermath of this Venezuela episode? Because we saw a lot happening in the world, and definitely there was previously a lot of progress and a lot of mean that the meetings going on the Russia-Ukraine peace deal, but then immediately everything was stopped. So, where you see this in the post-Venezuela scenario, the Russia-Ukraine peace deal?
Well, I'm not sure if there's actual progress being made. I think it's a bit like previous peace deals we made with Russia, or any deals we made with the Russians over the past 30 years. We made many deals. We had the EU NATO council, no, sorry, the NATO Russia Council. We had the we had yes, several arms controls deals. We had all these agreements that we wouldn't put our military infrastructure closer to the border. With Ukraine, we had the Minsk agreement, but with this, much like the current negotiations, it seems like the effort is to may make the Russians say accept that, oh, now you can have a possibility of peace. But then, of course, at some point we will pull back the actual offer. So, for example, now we say let's end the war, and it seems very genuine. But every time he comes back to this idea of a ceasefire, which is not a peace, because the Europeans are quite open what they want to do in a ceasefire. They want to rearm Ukraine, they want to fortify the defensive lines, and they want to essentially stabilize the front lines to prolong the war. And what is the United States doing? Is talking about peace, but it's nonetheless the CIA is the main intelligence agency attacking the Russians. These are American war planners in Germany. It's American intelligence agencies picking targets. It's American contractors using American weapons to strike into Russia. It's the Americans are still deeply involved, not just militarily. They're also economic. They're helping to attack Russian tankers, Russian refineries. They're putting pressure on countries around the world to stop trading with the Russians. So the Americans are still full into this war, and again, if they wanted to put an end to this war, they could. They could tell Zelensky and the Europeans, tomorrow we pull out our intelligence agencies, all support if you don't sign this deal. But they're not doing this. I think they're just leading from the rear. So I'm not certain if they actually are putting an end to this war.
So there's another development in the international arena, and that is that the US warplanes and the elite units have been landing in Britain. So how you see this heavily armed US military planes landing in British? So what does it mean that the US preparing for?
Well, again, they're fighting so many wars, it's hard to say. But on the Russian front, you still see American drones surveilling the Black Sea. What they're doing is picking targets for the Ukrainians, which we say Ukrainians, but likely it's the NATO countries pulling the trigger. Of course, you can also go to the Middle East, as I think a war against Iran, a do-over is probably overdue now as well. But no, the idea in Ukraine is they want massive Russian concessions. If they wanted big Russian concessions, they should have done this 2, 3, or 4 years ago, before we pulled out and prolonged this war as much as we could. But now, of course, we prolonged it for so long that the Russians are decisively winning, which means that the Russians have no incentive to make big concessions, especially when the concessions are on the key issues. Because the main thing the Russians want in Ukraine is they want to restore Ukraine's neutrality. That is to dislodge NATO and all its intelligence agencies from Ukraine, so it won't be used as a proxy. And territorial concessions, as this is the ultimate guarantee that these territories won't be used as a front line anymore. So the Americans say, oh, we're 90% or 95% close to a deal. But except for two important things, the neutrality and the territorial concessions. I mean, without this, there is no deal. Everything else is a minor issue. So I don't see them moving closer to an actual deal. So I think, sorry, where I was going was,
Thank you very much.
I think the weapons are meant to put more pressure on Russia because they want Russia to make the concessions. This is my point.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Glenn Diesen. I really appreciate for your insight. Thank you so much for joining in this live streaming of Eastern Horizon. And I think we will keep in touch
Well, thank you for the invitation.